Hi everybody, in this video we're going to learn a lot about commenting your code in JavaScript. Now commenting is one of those things that serves multiple purposes. One purpose it serves is entirely for yourself. As part of the code you're writing, you want to ignore some things, so you comment them out and your browser completely ignores them. But there's another more important part that commenting plays, and that is acting as a form of communication, either for others who might be looking at your code, maybe members of your team, or maybe even yourself when you're looking at your code a week or a month or even a few years later, and you want to try to understand what exactly your code is doing. So let's get started. So the first thing comments allow you to do, and this is probably one of the more common cases you'll use as part of learning JavaScript, is you can use comments to ignore some lines of code. So you have some code written and you don't want the browser to actually do something with it, you can just comment it out and it gets completely ignored. And we'll look at some examples of this, but just to keep in mind, there are two ways you can create comments. One way is by using the two slash symbols to comment out individual lines of code. And then you can also use the slash star and star slash to mark the beginning and end of an entire block of comments. So you can block out a chunk of things without having to go line by line by using the slash slash. So here's an example. Here we have a function called insecure login, and there's an if statement here. And you also have these two lines, let key equals math.random times 100,000, and then you're calling a process login function. Now notice that both of these lines have two slashes in front of them. And what that means is these two lines, you can visibly see them, but it's completely ignored by your browser. So when you're running this code, it'll act as if this if input statement will run, but these two lines will be almost as if they never existed. So commenting them out essentially deletes them from any knowledge your browser may have about what's going on there. So it's a great way to write something down and just temporarily delete it if you're trying to debug or if you want to try something and you don't know if you want to keep it there permanently. So it's a great way to just have lines be ignored. And the other approach is you can do individual lines like we saw previously, or you can just comment an entire block of code by using the opening and closing comment tags. I could call them comment tags, they really aren't tags, by using slash star and then star slash to essentially have this entire if statement just be completely ignored. Now just be careful when you're doing this to not forget to put the closing tag. If you don't do that, you might find that a large chunk of your page has now been essentially commented out, which is probably not what you're trying to do. So that's the part of commenting that is the straightforward, boring part where you just want to have some lines be ignored. So you have two different ways of doing this. But like I mentioned at the beginning, commenting also has another big part of it. It's because the code we write isn't exclusively just for our browser. Another important audience is human beings, just like us. And so for them, especially if you're in a team with other people, having a way to communicate what your code is doing is actually very, very important. And that's where commenting really plays a much larger role than just ignoring certain lines of text. And of course, this also applies if you're working solo, because there are countless times that I've written things like a year or two ago that I look back at it right now and I'm like, what exactly was I doing? What is this function doing? What's this code doing? If it had comments, that could kind of like lead me the right path to help me understand what's going on. So this is not just for you communicating what your code does to other people, it's also good for communicating it to yourself as well. And so there are two ways to make sure that the code you're writing communicates things very clearly. So one approach, which I always encourage you to do independent of anything else, is to write clear code that uses reasonable names for everything, is properly formatted, and logically makes sense. I mean, this seems like something that you would probably consider is a good thing, independent of any other factor that plays into what goes on. But the second solution is to also add some human understandable text as part of the code. And this is code that JavaScript completely ignores. This is basically going to be a comment. And so taking what we saw about comments earlier, let's look at the next example that we have here. Here we have some code. And notice that in this code, I have some comments, but what I've commented are not actually lines of text. They're actually lines of human readable text. Sorry, they're not lines of code, they're human readable text that communicates something to me or to someone else who is reading it. So for example, I have this comment that says set to false to stop dialog boxes. So the variable blah is set to true. This kind of tells me that if I set it to false, then maybe the dialog boxes will not be happening. And then inside this while statement, I have a block of comments where I have two lines of text, in which case I'm just saying that this is going to cause infinite dialog boxes and then ha 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 ha. So basically I'm just saying that if I were to continue with this, you'll see a lot of dialog boxes that keep going on. Now, this case is kind of trivial. the code is pretty self-explanatory and it may not require this much commenting, but I just want to give you an example of how you can use comments to communicate something to another person or to yourself in the future. But there are some best practices though that we need to follow. And of course, just to reemphasize this point, comments are completely ignored by JavaScript. And if you use a minifier, if you use any kind of code to make the size of your code a little bit smaller, the comments are stripped out. So you don't have to worry about adding comments as a way of somehow negatively impacting fundamentals like perf or file size or memory or things like that. So the two things that comments do are really they communicate with humans, which is always a good thing, and they also mark lines of code to be ignored, which is kind of the fundamental baseline thing that comments provide. So let's talk about some best practices. So the first thing is always comment your code as you're writing it. Don't do it tomorrow. Don't delay that till later because either you're just not going to come back and do the commenting because you're like, well, my code works now. I got something else I need to work on. Next item, my backlog, for example. Or you may just end up forgetting some subtle detail that is only fresh in your memory as you're actually writing your code. So best practice number one, always comment your code as you are writing it. And the second one, in case my first point was not fully clear, it's do not defer comment writing for later. So it's basically a restatement of what I mentioned earlier. And the second one is when you're writing comments, the goal really is to be as clear as you can be. And so use more English words and less JavaScript. Comments are not meant to be another replacement for the code you have written below. It's actually meant to provide more of a higher level understanding of what's going on so that someone who's reading it can still make sense of it without having to parse JavaScript code, which they can already do by just looking at your source code directly. And the next one is embrace whitespace. You don't want to have comments just be this one gigantic long line of text. You can actually, have spaces, you can have line breaks, you can have paragraphs. You can do all sorts of really nice things because, as we saw earlier, the multi-line open and closing commenting tags allow you to just write freeform and not worry about other code accidentally getting commented out or commented in accidentally. So imagine you're writing a document for someone. Imagine how you like for it to be formatted. You may not have all those formatting options in the code editor, but you can definitely do little things to adjust for it. And by embracing whitespace is one really good example. And the last one, which is a rule I did not follow in my example, is don't comment obvious things. Commenting is meant to be used for, really like providing some light into where code is doing something interesting. Pointing out things that are very obvious kind of takes away from that and might slow someone down who's trying to make sense of what your code is doing. So there you have it, a very quick overview of what comments are, little technical details on how to use them, the // and the */ opening comment tag and the /* closing comment tag, and a lot more time spent on how to make comments meaningful so that when you're communicating either to yourself or to other human beings, they find value in them and they don't think it's a gigantic waste of time. So takeaway is use comments a lot, and write comments as if you were the audience for it and you would find value in it if you were to look at it sometime down the road. So with that, if you want to learn more, go to KIRUPA.com. A bunch of articles and tutorials on comments and a lot of other topics. For help, post in the forums at forum.kirupa.com where I or someone else will be happy to reply to you quickly. Do not post questions in YouTube or on Twitter or somewhere else, mostly because the formatting options are just not great and it makes it very difficult for me to point back to them or refer to them at a later date. So please post online. You can find me on Twitter at KIRUPA. You can find me on Facebook and YouTube. Pretty much anywhere where there's a username that can be set, try KIRUPA. There's a very good chance that you got me. There are some other KIRUPAs out there as well, and they're pretty cool also, so if you want to follow them instead, I got no problems with that. Lastly, if you found this useful, tell your friends and enemies all about comments and all the things that you can do with them. Hit subscribe to be notified of new videos as they come online. Follow me on Twitter and Facebook so that my follower count is really high and I get this ego boost. And also, all the material you see here in this video is also available in paperback and ebook form in my JavaScript Apps Beginner's Guide, the second edition, which is out now. And so take a look at that, buy the book, and use that as a really cool paperweight if you don't have any paperweights or you have a table that is kind of wobbly. This book is just the right size where you can pretty much unwobble any table or any chair leg very easily with it. So go ahead and give that book a shot. And with that, I will see you all next time.